in Wired Word, we're talking about the way the Irish paid it forward to the Navajo and Hopi, who are suffering terribly from COVID-19. And they did this because during the Irish potato famine, this this disaster that caused Ireland so much turmoil in the early 19th century, apparently members of the Choctaw Nation and other Native American nations donated an enormous amount of money, especially at the time, to help the Irish people through their famine. Well, the Irish people never forgot that, so they not only returned the favor, but they did. They returned the favor by helping out the Native American tribes who are under duress in our day and age. And as you read through the article, you see that the Native Americans, when they initially helped out the Irish, that they considered it sort of paying forward. And we pay these things forward as we go along. We do random acts of kindness for each other, and hopefully we continue then to initiate random acts of kindness for other people as well. And it starts this sort of chain reaction. There was a movie a few years ago with Kevin Spacey as well about sort of paying it forward. And in American culture, I know sometimes we think if we're driving through Starbucks or something like that, we'll pay for the person in back of us. And that's certainly part of the concept. That's happened to me. I think it's really neat. And I've done it when I'm at Starbucks or something too. I'm like, just, let me pay for what's ever in back of me. Of course, it's always like a $300 order, but whatever, it's all good. So I liked this quote from Begay, one of the leaders of the Navajo Nation, who said, our goal is to give every Navajo and Hopi elder who needs it 1 2-week supply of food. We're still surging, the virus hasn't peaked yet, and they say it's gonna come back in the fall. So far, the group's helped between 2,000 and 3,000 people all over the reservation, along with several Hopi villages, according to Begay. They've also given masks made by an all-volunteer group of local seamstresses. All of this made possible, at least in part, by the generosity of the Irish people who had been given such a great gift so long ago. So this circle of giving in a time, especially in America, when we are seeing such turmoil and violence right now, reminded me that there is another way, and that millions of us actually around the world are more likely to do acts of kindness for each other than acts of violence against one another. And believe me, it's taken me at least all week to come to this conclusion. So, and maybe longer, because it's tough, right? It's tough right now. So, questions to start our day. When have you been the recipient of an act of kindness or help when the giver was paying forward a kindness that had been done to them? I'm going to stop this share so we can talk. There you are. Has anybody ever had yeah, Susan?
I've been the recipient of Pay It Forward a few times. Cool. And I know that it wasn't something that was done so that it could then be given back to her. It was something that was done through pureness. It was a purity that was far beyond paying it forward. And when it was actually happening, you could feel God coming through her, which was just undeniable. And I know in my heart that it had nothing to do with acting, do as unto others as you want back. No, it was a pure, paying it forward is a pure spiritual action.
Giving without expectation of return.
Yes.
I think that's beautiful, Susan. I think that's the definition of paying it forward. It's just something we do as an act of kindness that we feel compelled to do without desiring anything in return. But the universe sort of works this way as well. We're all given talents, gifts, and an abundance of one type or another to freely share with one another. And at the same time, when we need a little kindness or a little random act, it shows up in unique and unexpected ways most of the time in my experience. I've met some just strangers who have done the nicest things for me, and it's pretty amazing. Anybody else? Has anybody else been the recipient of a kindness or a help where somebody else was maybe paying it forward? Of course, you might not know that, right? If they're really paying it forward, you probably wouldn't know. So you know what? Never mind this question. I don't like it. How about you as an individual? When have you ever paid forward a kindness done for you? What, if anything, about that felt different from paying back the kindness? Let's talk about that a little bit. Is there a difference between paying forward something or paying back something?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think it is?
It becomes an act that has another purpose behind it besides just the giving. The giving is the gift that you're receiving while you're giving. But to pay back something, that's just keeping it all in circle, keeping it all alive.
Nancy.
I think if you know the person,
All of the Holy.
it's more likely to be a payback.
If you know the person, it's more likely to be a payback. Okay.
Yeah.
Nancy?
I look at it more of this energy flow, right? It's like if it's you're just paying back to someone, you know. So it's kind of this like between the two, you know, and when it's this invitation of paying it forward, it's like the divine spirit just kind of moving. I mean, I guess it's hard for me to explain, but I look at it more in the energy, and instead of just this back and forth, more into the invitation of divine love.
Paying it forward is an invitation from divine love. I love that. Yes. You know, the other thing about paying it back is it implies that something is owed to me. You know, we pay back somebody that we owe something to, whereas when we're paying it forward, we don't owe that person anything. We're just being kind. We're just doing something necessary. It's not necessarily a person either. The other thing I loved about this story is it shows that groups can do that, and it reminds us of the power of groups of people to change things in nonviolent ways. I don't want to get into the whole violence thing because that's a whole other issue, but I'm just saying. Helen?
Yes, I remember a few years back when Katrina came through, I had the grandchildren here, and all of a sudden, my oldest, Kaylee, said, Grandma, we ought to do something. So what she did, she got a can, she put a picture of things that were happening in New Orleans, and at church, a couple Sundays, there at Mandarin Avenue, we took money and sent it to the Week of Compassion. Kaylee and Casey had no idea, you know, what that money went for, but they knew that it was going to be done. So, you know, I was really proud of them. So I guess right now I'm trying to understand the younger people who are going into violence instead of doing things right now. I know there are some that are trying to stop some of this, but there are others that just seem to be violent. And as Kaylee and Casey, during Katrina, they saw the danger, and so they gave money through that. But I guess that's a giving, but they didn't expect anything back either.
Yeah, I'd say that's paying it forward. Because let me just say this one thing about violence, because I've had a lot of discussions about this on Facebook as well, especially with some law enforcement friends of mine. When your back is up against the wall and the system hasn't listened to you for 300 years, you're left with little choice. That's all I'll say about that. You know, and no revolution has ever happened with the people in power gladly handing over the keys. And I remind people of the way the American Revolution began too. It started with us dumping tea into Boston Harbor, ransacking and looting Boston. So, just FYI, just food for thought. I still don't condone it. I hope for and I pray for peaceful resolutions to things, but I do understand what happens when your back is against the wall. And in fact, the Bible is full of these stories about the Jewish people too. Their backs against the wall, and they're really left no choice, you know. So that doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do, but I understand. Grace.
and I think Meg has her fake me out hand raised. Do you see that thing? Anyway, isn't there a verse that says something like, if you love only those who love you, what honor have you? So that's kind of the paying it back thing, because you loved me and gave me this, and I love you, and I'll give this back to you. But what honor have you? So that's it.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And you know, this is kind of a recurring theme in the Bible as well, right? Because God so loves us, right? Then we pay forward that love of God in a variety of different ways as well. Oh, wait, we actually talked about this with respect to tithing too. But that's great, Grace, because yeah, now that I think about it, there are so many examples in the Bible of this idea of paying it forward simply out of gratitude for God's presence in our lives, or maybe even for just simply being alive. You know, it's a tremendous gift, and as frustrating as it can be at times, I suppose, but still, it's amazing to have this experience, and if we understand it as a God experience. And if we understand that all of us are having a God experience, for me anyway, it always makes it easier to relate to other people and freely give to other people too. It's not easy. Paying it forward, I think, is an interesting concept when you think about it spiritually, right? It asks us to. It's demanding. It asks us to do things for strangers, and humans aren't really good with strangers, as we can clearly see. Susan.
I find it amazing that almost 200 years ago, that the people who just came off the Trail of Tears was even able to get that amount of money and then to send it. I know they probably had a representative in Washington somewhere that probably met a representative from Ireland, but that just astounded me. And to me, that I could see why the Irish people at this point in time, thank goodness they know history and they pay attention, that they were able to actually respond in such a wonderful way right now, because our country's not helping the Navajo Nation. We're not doing anything for them again. And it's so
Oh, please, our
wonderful to
country
know.
did it to them.
Exactly, and still doing it. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on out there in New Mexico and Arizona. And so just the idea that they had so little and yet they gave it because they understood what the people were doing, that to me is like the epitome of the purest of paying it forward.
Yes, thank you. I was astounded too when I read that they had done this just after they'd gotten to Oklahoma, after this horrific journey that they were forced to take, and they still were filled with all of this generosity. I mean, if that's not an example of the movement and existence of God in our lives, I really just don't. I don't know what is. Then it's an amazing, it's an amazingly inspiring story. I thought this was a great choice for the Wired Word this week, and it was somewhat coincidental, although I don't believe in coincidences. So you know what I'm saying is the story came at the right time, at least for me, and my guess is for many of us here today, and other people who will watch this later. It's because it's inspiring. It fills me with hope. It reminds me that even in times of great duress, like we're in now, we can still pull together and do something necessary for other people, right? It helps us get out of our sense of self a little bit and be a little bit more concerned with somebody else's well-being, which is really a good way to stay humble and out of it. Think about other people's well-being. So in what ways do you think the golden rule is a pay it forward principle? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Think that's a pay it forward kind of idea? Or is that also about, yeah? I see heads nodding, that's good. So let's talk about that concept a little bit in today's climate. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. How do you think that might help us resolve some of the conflicts that we're seeing in our country today? Any of the numerous ones? All right, Nancy?
I think it's really important for us to look from the bias of the margins. I mean, as much as we could put ourselves there, right? And just engage, just learn. I mean, I had a conversation with the person of color 2 nights ago about everything. Just learning from there, just sitting and listening to their point of view to try to see how do I go forward and use my privilege, right? Because we have to give something away. Because we have ridden the privilege, you know, and it's like, how are we gonna, love is the great equalizer. And until we have conversations with people of color and try to see from their bias, to see what is our part in this and what can we do, you know?
Do you think it's possible that there could be some sort of consortium created or panel created whose task would be to reimagine American society more equitably and restructure and recreate all of the systems that are in place that are, you know, endemically racist or inequitable? It's really not just a racism problem. It's an ethnicity problem in general, but there's also gender issues and sexual orientation issues. You know, our country has a lot of conflict over our inability to love freely, it seems to me. And I'm not sure why we're so afraid to love freely. I guess it's a matter of holding on to power, but why? To what end? You know? Susan?
My fear with trying to put together a panel for discussion at this point, I think we need to draw more spiritual practices to bring it down, because that'll just be words. It'll be more words. We've been talking for 2,000 years, if not more. And look where we are, you know? So this is, I think deep in our hearts, we just need to let things happen, because this is what's supposed to happen, because things have to break before they, you know, get better. And I don't think words are doing it anymore. There's got to be another way. I don't think anyone has that answer. But and love is one thing, but you can say the word love, but what are you going to do today to show it? So I think we're in a much deeper place where we have to draw more on spiritual and consciousness practices instead of just sitting down and talking about how bad it is and what we might be able to do.
Oh, I agree completely. And I don't think we need to sit down and talk about how bad it is. Everybody knows how bad it is. But I do think at some point, and you're also right about things needing to break first. And this is another conversation I've been having that people seem to misunderstand. I'm not condoning violence. I'm just saying it's going to happen. This is history. This is the way things change. The whole cosmos is created out of violence. The Big Bang, any sort of creation, the death of a star, these are hugely violent acts that create entirely new things. Now, do we have to continue to do it that way? No, but we're obviously not evolved enough as a species. We're certainly not spiritually evolved enough to be able to just look around and say, okay, if these things aren't working out, they have to change. So unfortunately, to a certain sense, revolution is still necessary. And you're right. I think, you know, we'll go through this for a little while, but then out of that, there has to be the ability to work together in some way to change the system. Otherwise, this never goes away. It just keeps coming back, as it has for the last 300 years in this country. And as you said, Susan, for the last couple thousand years, really, even longer than that, for most of human history, we've had these issues. Helen.
Okay. I would like to hear Pat and George's idea. Remember, they went through that Ferguson deal a few years ago, and we were real concerned about them. I was wondering if maybe they could give us some idea of what Ferguson did, because apparently there is some neutrality right there now, because St. Louis so far has not come up with one of the cities. I don't know. Did Pat, George say what they did there?
Oh, that's a great idea, Helen. Pat and George, do you have any insight into that?
Just general, I think. The things that stick out in my mind was they kind of reorganized their thinking. They put together groups of people to address some of the issues, and it was not a group that was similar in makeup. It was very different. Maybe
Well, I'm thinking that there were parts of Ferguson that were very nice and are. I mean, and I think people have come together more and worked to help the blighted part of the city to refresh and grow. And different groups are going in and adding new businesses and opportunities for the people there. I do think the police department went through a complete override or change out. And things seem to be, it's just another St. Louis suburb pretty much now. Certainly the family always lifts up the anniversary of things that happened there, but in a positive way. And so I think it has, and I hope and pray that it continues. But at this point, it seems pretty much like any other suburb.
That's good. So there were some systemic changes made, it sounds like.
Yes.
yeah,
Well, that's great. See, that's what it's all about. That's the only way things change, because it's the system that's causing these things to happen. An unjust and inequitable system that prejudices against people of color. That has to change for any of this to change. And it does have to change at every local level before we can expect anything to change, I think, at a federal level. So that's really, again, another very hope-filled story that out of such tragedy, some change did actually occur. So
people owned up to the fact that things were not right. They took responsibility for it, and change came from that.
But that's only Ferguson. The city of St. Louis, that doesn't fit.
really,
Unfortunately, there's still a lot of work to be done there. A lot of crime and unrest and places that need to be helped along. And slowly there are things that happen, but to work towards that, but it's a work in progress.
I think people know some of the changes that need to be made. It's just a matter of doing it.
do you think this concept of paying it forward would maybe lights a fire in people to do the sort of tough work of systemic change that's necessary? If we think about it not as changing a system and losing something, but as actually giving a gift instead. How could we get people maybe to think that way, especially the people who are in positions where these changes can be made, right? Because we can all sit here all day, but none of us, I mean, I don't think any of us are on city councils or things like that where the decisions are actually made. I wonder if helping those people understand that what they're doing is more than just a civic duty, but it's a spiritual duty and a spiritual responsibility to pay forward God's unconditional love, right? And if that love is unconditional, then the things that we do, the laws that we create, the systems that we create, the way that we handle bank loans and finances and everything, those things should all be reflective of God's unconditional love and be equally accessible to every human being, no matter what.
I don't know whether this kind of fits in the playing it forward, but there is another program going on in St. Louis that, and I'm not sure exactly how it works, but they've brought in people from other neighborhoods that have, or other towns and cities throughout the country that have gone through this type of thing, and they've moved them into the neighborhoods themselves to kind of help grow,
Be a catalyst.
be a catalyst for change. But our leadership in the city of St. Louis isn't very good right now, so that's not helpful. It's the other things that are going on, sort of.
Well, leadership everywhere is just seems to be unhelpful anymore. I mean, in everywhere, all over the world, we look and I think our leaders are failing us largely. And
But
so
we can't look to others to take the mantle. I think that it has to be the people that live there. It has to begin there and be there.
yes,
You
I
can't,
agree.
the government will do it, you know, kind of mentality.
Mhm.
One of the things that strikes me, our church in Manchester, Missouri, has partnered with a downtown city Black church, and we get together a couple of times a year. We pray constantly for their church right now because they are also going through kind of a decline. And but anyway, I think if more churches did that, and you knew you had friends there, you tend to be a little more involved and aware of the problems that are going on.
Yeah, you know, talking to each other is an amazingly healing practice.
Right.
Nancy?
I just listened to Rachel Cargley, a woman of color, author, professor, on revolution. And kind of at the end of her talk, her next kind of charge for the listeners, the white people, she said, get involved in your research your local civil rights organizations, because they're already doing the work, and put your energy there for your local community. And actually that's what my next to do is, you know, a way that we can, she says, funnel your energy there, because they're doing the work that needs to be done. So that was kind of her charge on revolution.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, here in town we have a great organization. I can't remember the name. It's SURJ. Do you know them? It's Showing Up for Racial Justice. That's it. Showing Up for Racial Justice, and it's led by a wonderful woman, and it's a great coalition. And I know that they're always looking for help and support too. And I can send out an email with her email address and link if you're interested. That's a good place to start. And of course, the ACLU and other places as well. That's a great idea, Nancy. It's a good way to get involved. It's a good way to, and I would say that all of this goes along with the idea of paying it forward and the golden rule of doing unto others as we want done unto us. So there are ways that we can help, that we can be allies. There's a really great Facebook group right now also that has a lot of good information about being allies. And I'll post all of those links after we do this, when I post the video tomorrow as well. So check out the Facebook page and the website. All of that will be up. I usually have it done by early morning or so, barring any technical glitches. Charlotte?
Well, I know that a lot of this comes from people who are living in poverty, but also Black rich people live in fear. And so it's not just saying it's a socioeconomic issue, it's a racial issue. And we need to call it that, because it's not just the Blacks, the Hispanics and Asians and so forth often are encountered by prejudice. And as Pat was talking about, I think getting together in small groups and starting in your community is a way that I feel I could reach out, because I feel frustrated. My children live in Minneapolis, and I worry about them, and I know they're staying away from the areas and staying safe, but they still are living in a community that is an expensive place to live. And so I understand that many of the Blacks do not have an area of equality. My grandkids attend a school that's virtually 100% white in their suburban areas. So getting together with other groups, and not just once or twice a year, but at least once a month, so that you develop a relationship with them and you really get to know them, so that you go past the fear issues that so many people have.
Yeah, well said. It's absolutely true. This is an ethnicity problem. We've had it in this nation forever, and not just this nation. I mean, you see this problem in the Bible as well. When they talk about Samaritans, these were other groups of Jews, but for some reason they didn't like the Samaritans. Well, they had reasons for it, but they were nonsense. As most issues that we have with other ethnicities are nonsense, and it does come down to a matter of fear of the other, right? This is built into the human race, because again, this is partially an evolutionary mechanism that we're trying to fight against. And I think, as Susan said earlier, well, maybe you didn't say it, but I think you implied it, Susan, so I'm going to put words in your mouth. It's a spiritual dilemma. I believe, and I think I believe that in order to get past our ethnic fears, our physical fears, we have to develop on a deeper spiritual level to understand that our appearance is not who we are. That underneath the color of our skin or our gender or our sexual orientation is still the pure and light, loving being of God, without any exception. Now, people find this hard to believe, right? I talk to other people who really are much more religious than I am, and they have a real hard time understanding that, what I think is a very basic premise. We're all one thing. Is this not the Pentecost story? I mean, we'll talk about this in the next session at God Connect, but Pentecost is a moment of deep understanding, deep spiritual understanding, where we see each other for what we truly are. Unique and beautiful emanations of God. Every single one of us. And when we understand that, what happens? We all get giddy and we dance around and we laugh and we sing, because there's nothing to be afraid of anymore. We're afraid of each other for absolutely no reason. And we oppress each other because we're afraid of each other. So, and white people have got it down to a science, because we've been colonizing the world and oppressing everybody else that we met for 1,000 years. Grace.
What if part of what's happening is a call for a spiritual revolution? There's people that are activists, and it comes easier for them to go fight the battles or whatever. But from a spiritual point of view, I wonder if this time in history isn't a time that there can be some kind of a spiritual, not a renewal, because it's more than just having what we had before. It's not one of those, but a full revolution of learning the spiritual disciplines, like Susan said, and having, like the Pentecost, some power about your spiritual self. Because I think when we're really connected, it's supposed to have power with it, not external, you know what I mean? But like this inner power that other people can sense and stuff. I don't know what it would look like, this spiritual revolution, but people have been home for 3 months, and some people have been thinking about their soul, and it lends itself to a good time for some people to show the way or lead the way, or rather, yeah, I don't know. I'm just wondering if it's a call to, or if it's a sign that something deeper is happening and can happen among, you know, the people who know that we're light beings, or whatever you're saying there.
Well, I think, well, I wrote down spiritual revolution because I'm going to use that as the title for something, because it's awesome. And I think you're right. I think this not only calls us to spiritual revolution, but I think what we might be seeing are the effects of it taking place already. Because remember, everything in spirit is made flesh, right? So the unfortunate violence and turmoil that we're seeing is probably part of the effect of it, the spiritual revolution that's taking place. And in fact, the spiritual revolution that's taking place, and I think this revolution is ascension, is awakening. I think we are starting to wake up. I think more people are starting to wake up and see through this veil of reality that has said we are, you know, sinners and worthless, and we're separated from God, and we're separated from each other. I think people are starting to wake up and see that that's a lie. We've been lying to ourselves about this all the time, right? And we're starting to understand that there is no separation. We are not separated from God, and therefore we're not separated from each other. But for the people who haven't realized that yet, and can't go out and hug their Black neighbor or their Asian neighbor or their Hispanic neighbor, or they can't perform a wedding for a gay couple, they're fighting it because they're just not awake yet. And I know that sounds insulting, and I don't mean it to be insulting, because we've all been there. We're all there at some point. I'm certainly not an awakened, enlightened being. I have a host of issues that have, you know, so nobody's perfect. But I think we all are starting to wake up. And some of us will resist it more than others. And just think about your own personal spiritual journey and how difficult it's been for you at various times of your life to receive a new message about your spiritual being that obliterated anything you thought about who you were or what you believed. I know it's happened to everybody in this group. It's painful. And if you're like me, you probably fought it for a little while too, and went, yeah, I'm not going that direction, you know. But eventually, God wins, and you change, right? I don't think anybody in this group is in the same spiritual place that they were 5 years ago, certainly not 10 years ago. And truthfully, nobody in the world is in the same spiritual place that they were 5 years ago, whether they want to admit it or not, because spiritual growth is inevitable. It's part of being human. And I think what's happening now, partially because we've been cooped up, like Grace said, for a few months, we've had the opportunity to sit back and be quiet a little bit. And, you know, one has to consider the movement of God in all of this, throughout the world, moving through all of us and reshaping the energy of reality and causing us to, helping us to slow down, to sit back, to let the earth heal a little bit, to let ourselves heal, to let our souls heal a little bit. And as we start coming back out now, I think these conflicts are going to be flare-ups. There will be occurrences of these as the old energy fights against the new energy for dominance. But eventually, I think it's going to be there's a potential for an amazing new world to happen here. It's breaking through, and you can see it's, you know, we watched a movie the other night, Land of the Lost, about dinosaurs, and there's a scene where one of the dinosaurs is in an egg, and it's poking through the eggshell. I think that's what's happening in our world right now. I think God is sort of poking through the eggshell that we've made around humanity and breaking it all open, and it's shocking a lot of us. Well, it's shocking all of us, but some of us, you know, will react a little bit more violently to the shock. But it's change. Nancy.
We read about some of the trends emerging from this COVID, right? Like people are really searching in their spirituality, like Google for prayer, how it's going way up, you know? And I look at this format, Michael, and how you lead, and I think about Pentecost being able to speak in many languages. And you bring that, you bring different faith traditions, you welcome everybody to the table. You also bring in the similar constructs in different faiths and traditions that's needed. This is what's needed for us to go forward, to speak. We're all speaking. It's like there's many lands, but one sky, right? You know, we're all saying the same thing, but it's our vocabulary that divides us. And you're opening it up to a conversation that welcomes everyone. And I really feel this is what's needed, is what you are doing here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Hey, I couldn't do it without all of you and without all of the different opinions that we all have and the experiences that we all have. And I'll tell you, you know, in my heart, I've always wished that the group would include people who had spent their lives in other faith traditions, you know, more Buddhists and more Muslims and more Hindus and Jainists, you know. I'll tell you, one of the things that I miss most in quarantine is the interfaith services that we used to do a couple of times a year when we would all get together at the synagogue or at the temple or at the mosque or at a church or something and be able to share the common love of God that every faith tradition has. And I do think it's powerful. And thank you for mentioning it, because, you know, throughout my life and certainly throughout my career, I've taken a lot of heat for being a universalist. But I really think Jesus was a universalist. I don't think Jesus meant to do this exclusive thing that he turned into. I think he was very clear about the fact that this is all of us. And I think the fact that his message expanded beyond his Jewish community to the rest of the world is evidence that that God moves universally, that God's love isn't just for Christians or just for Jews or just for any other group, but that God's love is everything. And you're right, Nancy. I mean, all of the great faith traditions in the world, even the non-theistic faith traditions, talk about unity and oneness. I mean, nirvana is an experience of oneness, you know? So that's why I call most of the things that I write intersect, because I think that at the intersection of all of these different faith traditions, you find a commonality, which is learning that we are more than what we appear, that we are all part of the same thing. So, you know, it's a conversation that I think we should be having a lot more of, especially in ethnically diverse communities, because truthfully, the best way to live is to live in ethnically diverse communities. Again, I'll mention Dearborn, Michigan. It's one of my favorite places I've ever visited. It's an ethnically diverse community. I don't know how they're doing right now. I'm praying that everything's okay right there, because it could be a hotbed. But you know, I've been there several times, and it's just, you sit at a table and it's, you know, it's a Buddhist and a Muslim and a Christian and a Jew. It sounds like a joke, but it's just the way it is. And you all sit there and you're happy and you share each other's food, and you know, it's great. Food's another way to pay it forward, by the way. Ethnic food, starting to appreciate the food of another culture is a tricky way to get somebody into appreciating another culture in general, right? Hey, try this Indian food. You know, most Indians are Hindus, and they believe some really interesting things as well about the universe and the creation of the cosmos, and they jive really well with Christianity and Judaism So we can start conversations somewhat surreptitiously just by introducing our friends and neighbors and relatives to different aspects of different cultures, whether it's art, literature, music, And in America, we're not exposed that much to a diversity of cultures, really, not the way it is in Europe or in other places. And I think it helps. I think it helps bring people together. Well, man, this time is flying today, folks. Let's just take a quick look at a piece of scripture here. Let me show you this one. Where'd it go? Here it is. Right. Let's look at, I think I put 2 Corinthians on top, on purpose. And in this matter, I'm giving my advice. It's appropriate for you who began last year not only to do something, but even to desire to do something. Now finish doing it so that your eagerness may be matched by completing it according to your means. For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. And although Christianity was born among the Jews, the Apostle Paul eventually found his work of proclaiming the gospel to be primary to Gentiles. In time, the strong reception of Christ among the Gentiles caused the Jewish followers of Jesus in Mother Church in Jerusalem to wrestle with the whole issue of whether a person had to become a Jew first in order to follow Jesus. At a crucial meeting of the church leaders, described in Acts chapter 15, the matter was settled, and Gentiles were welcomed as full members of Christ's body without having to go through Judaism. In Paul's account of that same meeting in Galatians, he adds one other thing, that the leaders of the Jerusalem church asked only that Paul and those to whom he took the gospel message remember the poor, which Paul says he was eager to do. In any case, and elsewhere, Paul states that the intended recipients of this collection for the poor were those among the saints at Jerusalem in the Mother Church. So here's what we Christians know for sure. Giving at its heart is more a spiritual matter than a budget matter. It's never a quid pro quo. It's neither payment for blessings received nor a bribe for blessings hoped for. But it does have to do with gratitude for the faith handed down, for salvation given, for gospel joy, for confidence that God's way is the best way. It can't be paid back, and it isn't expected to, but it can and should be paid forward. So, what do you think about that idea, that giving at its heart is a spiritual matter? And if that's the case, how does that affect the way that we change the world? Susan?
Just to put this as a simple thought that just came through while you were reading that is being an artist. When I start a project, my whole passion is there. My entire imagination is there. I capture everything within me and around me to get into that piece. If I let it sit too long, that passion diminishes or changes over time. And I really read that passage as if you start something, keep your passion, keep your heart in it, and when you give it, it will be whole. It won't have rested by the side or taken a change. And that's what I get from that is do it and just do it and then complete it and then sit back and say, thank you, God.
Yeah, that's great. That's exactly what Paul is saying as well. And that's what Luke says in Acts, or whoever the author of Acts says too. Just do it. Do it and finish it. Get the idea in your heart, get inspired by God, and then go do the work, whatever that work means for you. It's very important also, I think, that passage about you do whatever you have the means to do, right? Because everybody has different gifts. Some of us might have a lot of money that we can give to causes. Some of us might be poor, but maybe we're brilliant artists, or maybe we're good writers, or maybe we're good speakers, or maybe we're just good at meeting people and forming connections, right? All of these things are needed. You know, something else that this just reminded me of too was the WPA during the Depression, during Roosevelt's New Deal. The WPA took everybody's talents and put them to use for the good of the entire country. We built dams, we built roads, we made terrific art installations, we built incredible buildings, right? I mean, writers, artists, poets, architects, engineers, people who dug holes for a living, everybody was working for the common good. Now, I'm being a little bit utopian about it, but you know, in general, you know, everybody's gifts were being utilized for the goodness of God. And we've done it before, we can do it again. It's a matter of, but it requires a concept change. We're in different spaces than we were then. But I still think the opportunity to allow everybody to be their best selves by doing the inherent talents that by using the inherent talents that we have is one of the keys to putting the pieces back together and hopefully eliminating the divisiveness that we're feeling so much more deeply now than I think maybe ever in human history.
Can I say
Yes.
one thing?
Yeah, of course.
You said, I think we're in the same place now. I really do think we have just done a 100-year cycle. We were going through the Depression. People had nothing. There were people dead by the roadside. People were starving. Infrastructure wasn't even there, let alone now it's imploding. And I think right now, if that concept could take hold in some leadership to bring everybody together to rebuild the country infrastructure and morally, ethically help each other out and bring the arts in and I think we would be in a maybe that's what we need. Maybe that's the direction. Because history repeats itself if you don't learn the first time. And
Yeah.
I think that would be a wonderful way to maybe just try to focus, maybe what kind of direction should we start consciously thinking about and holding.
Unity, unification, oneness in God's love. I think these are all important messages for our current era. And if we're not careful, well, we're probably headed toward the same sort of global depression that we experienced in the 20s as well. And perhaps that will force our hand back to the idea that we can and should be financing these large public works projects and sort of changing the way things are. Listen, when a system implodes on itself, you're left with little choice but to recreate it and hopefully make it better, right? If you had an engine and it blew up on you, you wouldn't put it back together the exact same way. You would try to put it back together so that it wouldn't blow up again, right? So we do these things with mechanical things all of the time. But when it comes to sort of systemic structures, we have less time. We seem to not be quite as imaginative or even quite as logical about it, right? A system will break and then we'll just put it back together the exact same way and then be astounded that it broke again. Again, we don't do that with anything else. We don't build a house out of mud bricks and then it gets washed away in the rain and we build it again with mud bricks. We find a better brick, We need to find a better brick. That's where we're at. Anything else, my friends? Before we take a 15-minute break and come back for God Connect to celebrate Pentecost. Today, go ahead. Who's that, Diane?
Yeah, hi, how are you?
We're excellent. How are you? What you got?
I do global work. I work with oil companies. I work with huge companies to restore mindfulness on what they're doing with their fingers and thumbs. So some of the projects completed was to have all the oil companies save their energy and then diversify their portfolio. And so they were invested in solar and wind and hydro. And then one of my relatives, I said, please don't drill so much in the ocean. Please save the whales. And so he went running to Sweden and they said, fossil free. And then Norway said, zero emissions. So I do impacts of dialogue. And the Pope said to me once, dialogue is the foundation that shapes the future society. So I listen to all of you who have some educational vocabulary, and I love the lady that mentioned vocabulary. How about we start with not letting them label us? Because when we let ancient societies create our vocabulary and label us and make us into the puppets that we are, we can break through by listening to our voices and listening to the words we say. So I was trying to hopefully come up with something that's universal. And I said, how about we're all mammals with fingers and thumbs that are very powerful? How about we all bleed red? And I like that one of the leaders that came into position as a representation of our country. He said, we all bleed red. He's hurting right now, and he's frustrated right now, and he has a lot of advisors that have old dialogue and old directives written down. You are white, you are black, you are this, and segregated and classified us. And then I went to a project to ask all of the peacekeepers and rescuers of our planet. And I said, please do not let them label you and segregate your thinking processes. And I'm working on some projects of chemical attack on the body. I'm very educated on anatomy. So I'm not black and I'm not white, but I come from the ancestors of Africa. I come from the ancestors that migrated from Africa into all of the regions of the Middle East. But my mom was from the north and my dad was from the Middle East and all of those regions. And in my house, my dad learned that he's the king of the castle. And it was very difficult to live with him. And I love him dearly for creating me with my mom. But it was very, very oppressive in the fact that the male dominance of those people that have this patriotic ideology is oppressive to all the females and the weaker. So can we start with our team? And when you go out your door, say, wait a minute, there is no white and there is no black. If you stay in the sun, you're going to change colors.
Yeah.
So let's try.
Yeah, Diane, I agree. You know, I do a sermon every now and then called The Human Race. And although I do think we need to understand there are ethnicities, right? And we do have differences. We are one race. We are the human race. All of us, right? There aren't different races, but there are ethnicities. And we should respect God's great diversity in those ethnicities as well. Part of the lesson, I think, is understanding the diversity of creation and accepting all of it, loving all, not just accepting it, but loving it wholeheartedly, loving God's diversity in every human being we see. Because underneath it all, we are all part of the same thing. Well said, Diane, thank you. Okay, my friends, let's take a quick little break and I'll see you at 10:15. Thank you.